Hello, everyone. I'm James Eade of the Eade Foundation. The Eade Foundation, you can call me Jim, but the Eade Foundation is dedicated to building communities through chess. And I don't care where you're from, what language you speak, if you play chess, you're part of the chess community. And if you're part of a community, you are never alone. Now, this show is the Chess Files. The answers are out there. And today's Chess Files is going to ask the question is who is the greatest chess player of all time? Now, if you want to start an argument, that's the best way to do it. And I do want to start an argument. Please email me, and you can see the banner across the bottom of the screen if you disagree with what I'm going to tell you. But the first thing we have to do, because I think the answer depends, and it depends on a lot of things. But first, we have to define our terms and establish our criteria. Otherwise, we're just talking past one another. We can argue endlessly without knowing what we're arguing about. So, what determines the best chess player of all time? The first time I thought about this, I thought, well, dominance. Like Babe Ruth was the greatest home run hitter ever in baseball. His single season records have been passed, his all time records have been passed. But at the time that he played, he was dominant. He hit more home runs in a single season than entire teams combined hit. There's never been a home run hitter like Babe Ruth compared to the people that played at the time that Babe Ruth played. So I don't care about the numbers. It's the dominance of the period. Now, you can get a false sense of precision by looking at the metrics. People can create ratings and say, oh, look, this person is rated 2807 and this person is rated 2806. Therefore, person A is better. That's a false sense of precision because there are so many factors that we have to take in. When we compare generations, how do we do that? People today have access to computers. They can learn and see games in such a small question of time, that they can absorb more information than was possible when I was growing up, let alone 100 years before I was growing up. So we cannot just assume that because players today play with more precision than players in the past, that they were better chess players. So in the United States, we were brought up with the idea that there was in the mid 1800s, we called that the Romantic era. And then it was followed by what we call the Classical era, which is followed by the Hypermodern era, which is followed by what we call the Soviet era. And then there's the modern era, which exists today. And of the Romantic era, I would say that Paul Morphy was probably the dominant player of the modern era. But you can make arguments, and that's what we're here for, to start arguments. But the classical period, I think Capablanca was the clear, the most dominant player of the classical period. And the hypermodern era, I would say the best player was Alekhine. And in the Soviet era, it started with Botvinnik, who was clearly the dominant player of the 1940s, and pretty much ended with Karpov. And the modern era probably started with Kasparov. That's the way I would say it. And so who's the best player of each period? You can argue about that, but why not talk about the best player of all time? Everybody can make their list. And I started writing Chess for Dummies back in 1995, and I didn't even know the name Magnus Carlsen. So each edition, it's in the 4th edition now, each edition has had a different top 10 players of all time. So I'll give you what I currently think, but my thinking has changed. And my thinking probably will change because Carlsen just might have a bullet next to his name going up this list. So I will start with who I think is the greatest player of all time. I think it's Garry Kasparov. Now I know some of you are going to say, oh no, Bobby Fischer, oh no, Paul Morphy, oh no, someone else. No, I think Kasparov is clearly dominant. And if we look at dominance, you have to think, well, who were they dominating? So it gets a little iffy. because clearly he did not dominate Karpov early on in their careers, or later in Karpov's career and early in Kasparov's career. There was no dominance of Karpov by Kasparov, certainly not. They played 5 titanic matches for the World Championship, and the overall score was close to even. Razor edge to Kasparov. So there's got to be something besides dominance, because it depends on who you're competing against. So what are we going to say? Longevity? How great were you for how long? That might be a factor. That might be there may be other factors as well. But we have to consider the player, the time that they were playing, and the players they were competing against. Now, after Kasparov, it might surprise people, but I think Karpov is the second greatest player of all time. He was clearly the dominant player of what we call the Soviet era. And he still was very dominant in except for Kasparov, into the modern era. Now, Karpov won tournament after tournament. Some people say, well, he never beat Bobby Fischer. The match never occurred between Bobby Fischer and Karpov. Who cares? Karpov won tournament after tournament, match after match. He was dominant. He's clearly the player. You could argue whether Fischer could have beaten him or not, but the question is moot because they never played. And they never played because Fischer didn't play. After 1972, after an amazing victory over Boris Spassky, Fischer did not play a serious game of chess again. He played an exhibition match, sure, but that was different. That was not for the World Championship. I don't care. Who says it was? It was not. Karpov was world champion. Karpov earned the world champion. And I think he was the second greatest player of all time after Kasparov. Now, let's say who's next? Well, I think if you look at the end of the Soviet era, it ended with Bobby Fischer. Bobby Fischer was dominant. He was undefeated in U.S. championship matches. He won 6-0, 6-0 against the strongest grandmasters of the time. He dominated a former world champion in Petrosian. And then he went down 0-2 to Boris Spassky, who some thought was the greatest player of that era. And then he came back, he stormed back and beat Spassky. Now that was a dominant performance. Fischer, at his best, was dominant. Fischer went from the late 50s to the early 70s and then disappeared. Some might say that's a tragedy. And they might be right. He was a second example of the pride and sorrow of chess, because he made players like me play chess. And there's a whole generation of players like me who started because of Bobby Fischer. I think he's the third strongest player of all time, the third greatest player of all time. And the fourth greatest player of all time, is, according to myself, would be Capablanca. Capablanca was clearly the dominant player of the classical period before the hypermodern chess. Capablanca was so dominant that they called him the machine. Bobby Fischer, they had Fischer fever. They were afraid to play him. They got sick before they played him. They would say, "Oh, I wasn't feeling well." Yeah, you had Fischer fever. It was the same with Capablanca, the chess machine. People were lost before they sat down to play him. He was so dominant that they could not put up their normal resistance. They were defeated before they sat down. That's how dominant Capablanca was. But he, as many of them are, had a little lazy streak, and he did not absorb the hypermodern ideas the way that Alekhine did. But before I get into Alekhine, I will think about the fifth greatest player of all time. And I would say that's Paul Morphy. He seemed to dominate what we called the Romantic era of chess. And he beat all comers. Now, the match between Staunton and Morphy never came off, but people like myself, many of us would think that if Staunton did play him, Morphy would have won. And he trounced the players that he did play. And he played at a level that was beyond anyone of his time. Now, I think Paul Morphy was a meteor. He flamed, and there was an explosion of Paul Morphy chess, and then it burned out. He was the original pride and sorrow of chess. But Paul Morphy, I think, belongs on this list. And if your basis is dominance, or if your basis is longevity, you might move him up, you might move him down. Doesn't matter. Let's argue. Because I think he was the 5th greatest player of all time. Now, that's the Eade Foundation sponsoring the first top 5. The bottom top 5, I think we're going to go and bring in another sponsor. And that's the Family Dollar Store. Now, the Family Dollar Store is run by Lynn Shepard, and he's not sponsoring me in the traditional sense, but he gave me encouragement to do my own show. And so I want to let the people know that you can buy quality products inexpensively at the Family Dollar Store. Now let's go to the bottom half of the top 10. Now the bottom half is still very good quality. Now, I would put Emanuel Lasker at the top of the bottom half. He's the best player. He comes in right after Morphy. He was a dominant player. Now, he won the World Championship in 1894, if memory serves, and he held it until 1921. Now, it's the longest period of time that anyone has held the World Championship, so you would think, well, wouldn't Lasker be number 1? Well, there's some things that you have to take into consideration. One is that he did have a drawn match with Carl Schlechter. And 2 is the outbreak of World War I prevented maybe his stiffest competition, Jakob Rubinstein, from ever competing for the title. And there's many of us who believe that Rubinstein would have defeated Lasker. And what about Capablanca, who I clearly think was a stronger player in history than Lasker? And they didn't play until 1921. What if they played in 1917? Well, they couldn't. World War I. I think maybe in 1917, 1918, Capablanca would have defeated him. I think he was clearly better at that time. Now, you can argue about that, and I hope you do. But Lasker was unbelievably dominant. He played in 5 tremendous tournaments. St. Petersburg, 1895, Nuremberg, 1896, London, 1899, Paris, 1900, and won them all. So he was a dominant tournament player. He dominated Tarrasch in their World Championship matches. Tarrasch was a very, very good player. Worthy of consideration on the honorable mention list. His Game of Chess was a great book, and it's still valuable today. Now, dominating a player like that, Lasker was the real deal. So I put him at the top of the bottom half, followed by Steinitz. Now, Steinitz was a great player, great tournament player, great match player. Maybe not as good a tournament player as he was a match player, but he introduced the classical era. He gave us a system of how to play chess that was not part of the modern era. After Steinitz, chess had changed. He was remarkable in his synthesis of ideas and how he codified them, and so that he could instruct others, that we could learn from him. We could watch a Paul Morphy game and go, wow, but how much could we learn from it? How much could we learn from him? What did he write about it? Steinitz codified it. He wrote it down for others to learn from his principles of play. And he ushered into the classical era. A longtime champion, dominant match player, Steinitz, is right after Lasker, in my opinion. Argue with me. Now, after Steinitz, who would I say? I would say Alekian. Alekian, I would think, is the best representative of the hypermodern school of chess. He synthesized the ideas that Capablanca was a little too bored to pay attention to. And he took all the knowledge of the classical school and all the knowledge of the hypermodern school and put them together and became a great champion. He was a great champion. Now, he had his flaws. He had some ups and downs. And he played in 15 major tournaments and won 8 of them. So, he wasn't always at his best. And he lost the match here. And also the thing I don't like about Alekian, I can't push him too high on the list, is because he owned the title and he chose his challengers. Well, that's true of Capablanca, true of Lasker, certainly. But he really abused that privilege, I think, as no other. Maybe Lasker, you can make that argument. But I think Alekian really chose players he was confident he could beat. And that doesn't make him a world-class person, in my mind, whatever his chess talents may be. Because we could have seen some greater chess games that will never, ever be played. Now, after Alekian, the best of the hypermodern era, I would have to say, go with the modern era. Magnus Carlsen comes in next, and he's got a bullet by his name. I don't know where he's going. Can I put him over Alekian yet? I don't think so. Maybe. I don't know. But he's making his mark. And how long does he last at this level of play? Well, if he lasts 5 more years at this level, he's going to go up the list. My goodness. All the competition that he faces and his consistent winning record, match play, tournament play, the guy's amazing. So, out of the modern school, my goodness gracious, he's going up the list. I don't know where he's going to end up, but he's the real deal in historical terms. And to last play in the top 10, I'd have to give it to Botvinnik. Because Botvinnik was clearly the dominant player of the 1940s. And he really ushered in the Soviet era, which there's Soviet dominance from the 40s until Fischer was indisputable. Now, he did have some world championship match losses. Lost to Smyslov, he lost to Tal, he drew with Braunstein, but he was the personification of the scientific approach to chess. This is the other criteria that I didn't get into, because chess has 3 different components to it. You ask most of the grandmasters that I've spoken to, I ask them, is chess a science? Is it a sport? Is it an art? They say it has all 3. So if you're a sportsman, you think of chess, you think of results. Who won? Scoreboard. But if you're a scientist, you think of who is the most precise player. Botvinnik is very precise. Botvinnik was systematic. He programmed not only his chess knowledge, but himself. He was physically fit when he showed up at the board. He was not like Alekian, who came in sometimes maybe not in his best form. And he was a dominant player for a very, very long period of time. And you can put him up this list, you can put him down this list, but I don't think you can put him out of it. Now, the artistic players are going to say, where? You've gone to 10 players, where is Mikhail Tal? I know. Carlsen bumped him off the list. Sorry, guys. Tal was a great player, a fantastic player, a miraculous player, a stunning player. But he was world champion for a short period of time. Botvinnik beat him in the return match. And Tal was not consistent. Yes, his health was a bit iffy. Maybe his approach to chess was a little bit suboptimal because he didn't take care of his health, didn't take care of himself. He did not show up with the discipline that Mikhail Botvinnik did. but he was a great, magnificent example of the art of chess. But he got bumped off the top 10 of all time by Magnus Carlsen. That's the Chess Files. That's who's the greatest chess player of all time. And let's argue about it, because the answers are out there. Thank you for tuning in. And this is Jim Eade, signing off from the Eade Foundation. And stay tuned next.